Thank you everyone for joining the National Health Council's fourth webinar in our series on clinical outcome assessments. Today we will introduce another new topic, the concept of interest and context of use. But before we get started, I wanted to just go over a few housekeeping items. The first and perhaps most important is please ensure that you're on mute throughout the call. I know everyone's probably at home who's on the East Coast or in the DC area, so we don't need to hear any cats or babies or anything like that. Thank you. And also, please feel free to ask questions throughout, but to make it easiest on our speaker, we ask that you please submit questions through the chat function. And to access the chat function, if it doesn't already appear on the right-hand column, you can click on the bottom banner, and there's a small text bubble that you can click on, and it'll appear on the right-hand side. So feel free to go ahead and submit any questions, and we'll either review them during the webinar if it's a clarifying question, or hold it off until the end. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Sorry, is it not showing that I changed it?
Just to the next one, to the objectives will be good. Thank you.
There you
go. Okay, great. So we wanted to start off with just reviewing the objectives of this presentation, and then we'll also review several of the introductory terms that we've covered on previous webinars as well. Primarily to bring folks up to speed on clinical outcome assessment, what are they, as well as just some foundational terms that will help you throughout this particular presentation. I'll then introduce our speaker, Rosie Love, and she'll review the concept of interest, context of use, as well as several other terms, provide an example, and then we'll go through any questions that have been submitted throughout the presentation, and then also announce our March topic. So the objective of this presentation will be to introduce to a patient group audience clinical outcome assessment, or COA terminology, as well as relevant examples. At the end of this webinar, we anticipate that participants will be able to actively participate in future discussions that include topics of concept of interest, the context of use, to a smaller degree, content validity, concept elicitation, as well as cognitive interviewing. Next slide, please. So before we get started, we wanted to just quickly review what is a clinical outcome assessment. Here we have the FDA's definition of a COA, and it is something that measures a patient's symptoms, overall mental state, or the effects of a disease or condition on how the patient functions. Essentially, they tell you something about how a patient feels or functions. Next slide, please. Here we can see the 4 different tools that fall under the COA, or clinical outcome assessment, umbrella. Perhaps the most well-known is the patient-reported outcome measure, or PROs. And these are reports that come from the patient about the status of a patient's health condition without amendment or interpretation by the patient's report by a clinician or anyone else. Additionally, we have clinician-reported outcome measures, or ClinROs, which are reports that come from a trained healthcare professional after observation of a patient's health or condition. We also have observer-reported outcome measures, or OBSROs, and observations by someone other than the patient or a health professional. So this could be a parent, a spouse, or any other non-clinical caregiver who is in a position to regularly observe and report on a specific aspect of the patient's health. For example, a teacher might be an appropriate observer. Performance outcome measures also fall under the COA umbrella, and they are based on a task performed by a patient according to instructions that is administered by someone trained, such as a healthcare professional. So keep these in mind as we go through this webinar as well as the others, that when we are referring to COAs or clinical outcome assessment tools, that we're referring to all of these 4 different types. Next slide, please. And before introducing Rosie, this is another very important concept, is there's often confusion over patient-centeredness and patient-reported outcomes. And so often so patient-centered outcome would be an outcome that patients report as important to them. And a patient-reported outcome is an outcome reported only by the patient on how they feel or function. And so you can imagine that there can often be overlap if a patient is reporting on a symptom that's important to them. But since patients also, of course, care about other outcomes that might not be most appropriately captured through a patient report, there are also patient-centered outcomes that are not patient-reported. They could be a clinical measure, or they could be a ClinRO or one of these other categories of outcome measures. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now I'd like to turn it over to our guest speaker, Rosie Love. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy in the Department of Pharmaceutical Health Services Research, where she concentrates on comparative effectiveness research as well as patient-centered outcomes research. She's a mixed methods researcher with experience and expertise in patient engagement methods and qualitative and quantitative research in the development of patient-reported outcome measures. Prior to joining the University of Maryland, she served as a research manager for Ipsos Global Evidence Value and Access, and also as an associate outcomes researcher for ICON Commercialization and Outcomes. She has her bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and an MPH from Drexel University. So I'll turn it over to you, Rosie. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'm very excited to talk to everybody today about successful COAs and define what a concept of interest is and what a context of use is. That we'll talk about today, as we already said earlier, our concept of interest, or COI, context of use, or COU, content validity, concept elicitation, and cognitive interviewing. So the FDA-NIH Biomarker Working Group defines concept of interest as, in a regulatory context, the concept is the aspect of an individual's clinical, biological, physical, or functional state, or the experience that the assessment is intended to capture or reflect. So this is really the thing that we are trying to measure with our instruments. The COI must be related to how a patient feels, functions, or survives. So examples of this would be worsening of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, symptoms in a COPD drug trial, or improvement of hemophilia symptoms in a hemophilia drug trial. Moving on to context of use, again, we have a formal definition from the FDA-NIH Biomarker Working Group that states a statement that fully and clearly describes the way the medical product tool is to be used and the medical product development related purpose of the use. So this is pretty much situations under which the COA instrument will be used. So it includes a detailed description of the patient characteristics and how they classify as having the disease or the natural history of the disease. So that would be something like the disease onset or diagnosis, the target population, which is really important to know which group you're exactly targeting with this instrument. So that would be patients with more or less severe states. The study design, whether it'll be used in a randomized controlled trial, a precise definition of the outcome of interest. So for example, disease-free survival is often used, and the length of time between treatment and relapse. and then whether the outcome of interest should be a primary, secondary, or exploratory endpoint in the study. So putting the terms into context, we'll talk through an example of a patient-reported outcome measure. This is an instrument that was developed for non-small cell lung cancer, or NSCLC. The instrument, called the NSCLC SAQ, or Symptom Assessment Questionnaire, focused on measuring a concept of interest, or the thing that we want to measure around symptom severity. The symptoms identified by patient input included cough, pain, fatigue, and appetite. And the context of use for this instrument, or the very specific definition or situation in which the COA will be used, targeted adults that were in a very specific stage of their disease. So in this case, it was stage 3B or 4 NSCLC, and both treatment-naive and treated patients. So here you can see that treatment-naive is very specifically defined as treatment-naive to current chemotherapy and not having received chemotherapy for the past 6 months of study enrollment. So when we talk about COU, we're really referring to something very specific that really defines how the instrument will be used. And when we talk about successful COAs, we really want to see that there is documentation of patient involvement in the development of the COA. And that's really necessary for success, for a successful COA. And when we talk about soundness of the COA, we're looking for demonstration of the content validity, which must be based on direct input from an adequate sample of patients from the targeted clinical study population. We're also looking for qualitative data from patients and others, and that is essential for establishing the soundness of all COA instruments. And this is especially true for patient-reported outcome measures, but it's also true for clinician-reported outcome measures, observer-reported outcome measures, and performance-reported outcome measures. So next we'll go over in depth how these terms are related. This framework is found in the patient. Hello? Sorry. This framework is found in the patient-reported outcome guidance. It is also known as the wheel and spokes diagram because of the process for developing a fit-for-purpose COA is iterative. What I would like you to know about this diagram is the very first step of the process, which involves identifying the context of use and concept of interest, which is the focus of today's webinar. The entire process proceeds clockwise around the wheel until you reach the end, where you may need to modify the COA or the context of use and reevaluate. So when we talk about content validity, we're really talking about our goal for this. And we're asking whether the instrument effectively measures the things that patients care about. This means that items, domains, and scores reflect what is most important to patients. And we do this through generating qualitative data, and that is essential for establishing our content validity of our COA. So there are some methods for doing this, and the first method that we're going to talk about is concept elicitation. Concept elicitation is a method to establish content validity. It's a type of qualitative interview that is used to identify what patients care about. Concept elicitation methods are the first part of the evidence supporting content validity. You can do them through both individual interviews and focus groups. So an individual interview would be one-on-one with an interviewer, and a focus group may be 3, 4, 5 people in the room who are in the room with an interviewer and talking about their symptoms and answering questions that the interviewer has. So the concept elicitation process is intentionally broad to explore and define information from the perspective of the patient. And what that means is that we're really hoping that patients will spontaneously report their symptoms without any guidance or encouragement from the interviewer. We want them to be able to explain to us what it is that they feel or what they experience. And once you've developed your draft items based on your findings in your concept elicitation interviews, the next method that we would use to establish content validity is through cognitive interviews for your draft instrument. In a cognitive interview, we are trying to answer whether a draft version of the instrument reflects things that are important to patients and whether it is easy to understand and complete. So cognitive interviewing is done to ensure that the instrument content captures the most important aspects of the concepts of interest and whether respondents understand how to complete the instrument, how to reference the correct recall period, the meaning of the items, how to use the response scales, and any other features of the instrument that may influence responses in the intended mode of administration. So we want to make sure that patients really understand how to use these response options. And so an example of this would be 10 equals best and 1 equals worst. And so when I'm asking patients about whether they understand the scale that's provided to them, I will ask them what 10 means to them and what 1 means to them. Now we'll walk through an example of identifying the concept of interest and context of use. As we discussed before, qualitative research is used to ensure the concepts are referred to the same way that patients do. So in this example for COPD, difficulty breathing is referred to as not getting enough air or having trouble breathing. And activity-related impacts of COPD are referred to as I had to gasp for air every few steps, or when I managed to get out of bed, I might get out of breath just trying to do some normal things like empty the dishwasher. So for this instrument for COPD, patients identified breathlessness, which is a symptom of COPD, as a concept that was important to them. So in order to measure this concept of interest, an item in the instrument needs to reflect this. So here we have the example of an item in the instrument such as, were you short of breath today when performing your usual activities like washing or dressing? With the key takeaway here that measures should include questions or concepts that patients care about and language they understand. So if you recall in the previous slide, patients made a connection in how they defined difficulty breathing with activities they do on a daily basis, such as washing or dressing. So this would allow us to measure this concept in a way that patients with COPD will find relevant and understandable. In this instrument for COPD called the EXACT, the target population, it should be used in a way that is very clearly defined. So for example, EXACT is for use in studies enrolling outpatients with acute bacterial exacerbation of chronic bronchitis in patients with COPD. So that's a lot to take on, I know. But we really want to focus on the second part of the statement where it says who meet the clinical trial entry criteria as described in the ABE/CB COPD guidance. So this is a specific guidance that was developed for this disease area. So really they're looking for a specific type of patient, which is the outpatient. So they really don't want to use this instrument among people who have more severe cases of the disease or patients who maybe require hospitalization. So that's what the second part of this definition really defines. So the key takeaway here is the context of use is really specific for the instrument that you've developed. So walking through the concept of interest and context of use for the EXACT instrument, here the concept of interest are the symptoms of COPD that are identified as important by patients. So again, as we mentioned, you would see some qualitative data that demonstrates that patients have said this is the way they refer to their disease. And the context of use is specific for outpatients who meet this clinical trial entry criteria as described in the guidance. And finally, we wanted to bring caution to a phrase you may hear often, which is we used a validated questionnaire. So in this context, we're looking at the exact tool, and it is a validated questionnaire, but it's been validated in a very specific context of use. So while the questionnaire may be validated, it is only validated for the original context of use. So if somebody were to say, oh, I'll use a validated questionnaire, if an instrument is being used for a different context of use, documentation of measurement properties such as content validity in the new context of use must be demonstrated. So I will turn it back over to Elizabeth, who will go ahead and walk through the rest of the slides.
We actually had a couple of questions that came in, so we'll hold off on the next piece of the presentation, but just stick with COIs and COUs for a little while. So one of the questions that came in was, is the process for identifying concepts of interests and contexts of use the same for all types of COAs?
So the correct answer would really be no. So for example, there may be situations where there are diseases where patients can't provide input. So somebody such as a caregiver or an experienced clinician would need to provide input on behalf of the patient, so they're not able to self-report. So those would be situations where we can use clinician interviews or caregiver interviews in place of patient interviews. So it won't always start with patients. However, if it is possible to have patient input in all cases, whether it's a clinician-reported outcome, an observer-reported outcome, patient data and patient input should be collected. Does that help?
Yeah, that's helpful. One other question that came in was also related to there was another column in your tables that was the DDT COA number and instrument name. If you might be able to review where those come from and also how they fit into the rest of the table.
I'm sorry, which slide were you talking about? The previous one, or?
I think I can answer it. Actually, it's from the COA team at FDA, and so it links back to sort of the theme for why we're covering clinical outcome assessments for patient audiences. In the first place is that there's an importance right now with patients becoming involved in this process, and also with the guidances coming out over the coming year, we expect that there will be a huge amount of interest from industry as well as from other researchers to engage patients in this process. So actually, Rosie, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you might be able to just tie this back also just to the review process also at FDA and how this ties back to how patients are involved in the larger conversation of patient-focused drug development and clinical outcome assessment development.
Sure. So I guess I'm not quite understanding your question, but in terms of the instruments that have been developed here and are presented this is from the compendium, I believe. Is that where this is from?
Yes, it looks like it's from the FDA's qualification program.
Yeah, so the FDA's qualification program, the staff at the FDA and clinical outcome assessment are in charge of reviewing clinical outcome assessment measures that are submitted to them for review and for certification, I believe is what the word is called. But for qualification. So the qualification program involves looking at the instrument properties, looking for how the instrument was developed and for which context of use it was developed in, and then determining whether this would be something that they would be aligned with the standards of the development of clinical outcome assessments and that the FDA has developed. So the FDA has currently a patient-reported outcome guidance that was released in 2009, and there are a new series of guidances that are coming out that will update this 2009 guidance and will provide more information around a lot of the things that we're missing. So some of the things that we presented today, such as identifying that concept of interest and that context of use and measurement development. So the new guidances will really provide people with an idea of what successful COAs should look like. Does that help?
Great, thank you. And we also received another question is we're doing some work at the National Alliance for Caregivers to better define the caregiver role. Sometimes they seem to be proxies, and sometimes they seem to operate more through obs roles. Interesting to know how this is actually working in practice.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. So the question was, is also, something for you just to comment on as well is, we're doing some work at the National Alliance for Caregivers to better define the caregiver role. So caregivers sometimes seem to be proxies, and sometimes they seem to operate more as observers. So perhaps they'd be asked to respond to an observer reported outcome. It would be interesting to know how this works in practice. So when okay, so I understand the question. So if it's, perhaps if it's a child or somebody who might not be able to respond directly to a patient-reported outcome, sometimes caregivers provide a report on their behalf as proxies, but sometimes it's through something more formally recognized as an observer-reported outcome. So if you might just be able to provide a little bit of background on, the role of patient-reported, the difference between patient-reported outcomes and observer-reported outcomes.
Sure. So patient-reported outcomes, you guys have gone over the definition of this, but in developing a patient-reported outcome, you would have direct patient input in defining what those concepts of interest are, or in cognitively interviewing the instrument to make sure that it directly reflects exactly how a patient refers to their illness or their symptoms. And in an observer-reported outcome, typically, especially in the example that you described, which was with children, children aren't always able to communicate exactly what it is that they're feeling. But an observer, even though they can't say how a patient feels, there are signs that they can see that may lead them to think that they're bothered by their symptoms. So one of the most common examples is a child tugging on their ear when they have an ear infection. So while they can't talk about the pain that the child is experiencing, they can talk about the signs that they see as an observer. So their input there would be not necessarily how a patient feels, but potentially signs that tell them what they're experiencing. Does that make sense?
Thank you. I also had a note from Eleanor that she wanted to chime in, so we'll just unmute her quickly.
Hello, Elizabeth, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to add to what the question, because I think it's a really important question. I think everyone should understand the difference between a proxy and an observer-reported outcome. These are two completely different things. And you try to stay away from using a proxy. And a proxy is, I am speaking for the patient. I am answering for the patient. There may be some circumstances where that's the only thing that you can do, but you really want to avoid doing that. Instead, doing an observer-reported outcome where the observer says, this is my interpretation, this is my view of what I am observing. I'm observing that someone is having difficulty walking. I'm observing that the child is tugging on its ear. I'm observing that they seem to have a loss of appetite because they don't eat the food that I've put in front of them. So when you put together an observer-reported outcome, an OBSRO, which is a clinical outcome assessment, you would do the kinds of things that Rosie has talked about in terms of concept of interest by talking to both observers, the observer that you intend to get the information from, like a caregiver or a parent, but you would also make sure that the concepts that you are following through on and they're interested in are concepts that are interested are of importance to patients. And so to the extent that you can, you should begin with patients to make sure that the concept is important to them. And you should also be bringing in the parent or the caregiver that you intend to ask the questions of and get their views also when you're zeroing in on the concept of interest and the context of use. And that it's always important to get the patient's view, and then in addition, you also want to add getting the views through the concept elicitation and other mechanisms for getting the intended audience, the target audience that you intend to ask those questions of. So really important that proxy is not the same as observer-reported outcome. They are very different. It's usually better to do an observer-reported outcome, and you would technically use the same methods that Rosie talked about in her presentation with those other observers as well as with the patient population.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
I also wanted to add that I think it's important for everyone to understand that, when the FDA is going to review these kinds of endpoints that have been used in clinical trials or being used in a drug development program, they will, of course, want to look at the validity, as Rosie had mentioned earlier. And as part of their assessment of whether or not the questionnaire or tool or instrument is valid, then they're going to ask about how was it determined what the concept of use was, what the concept of interest was and what the context of use will be. How were these things determined? And it's very important to remember up front that patients should be involved in that discussion. If they aren't, then you can really question the validity of the instrument and its origin, where it came from. And so even if we're using a questionnaire that already exists, we have to go back and really make sure and test whether or not it's getting at concepts that patients care about and are important to them. That will help support the validity of using that tool. So patients will have a very growing and vital role in COAs.
Great, thank you. If there aren't any other questions, we can move to introduce the upcoming topic for next month. So next month we will be covering another important topic, patient-reported outcomes versus patient-reported preferences. So we often hear about both of these. Sometimes they're incorrectly used synonymously. And so we will cover this topic in detail and introduce the differences and also similarities. Now, the date will be circulated by email after this call alongside the typical follow-ups to these webinars, where you'll also receive the recording from this webinar and a link to our other webinars in the series. Next slide, please. And I also wanted to remind everybody that we have an open survey on our website that lists out, the previous slide please, that lists where we're soliciting suggestions for other topics that you would like to be seen covered as part of this series. And so feel free to go on there and submit any additional topics that you're interested in having us cover. And that is all for today's presentation. Thank you so much.